Hello everyone, I'm here today to do my wrap up for March, and in March I read 9 books. The TBR in my story graph has gone from 39 books to 38 because I have also added some books, and the books in my ancient TBR, which is the books that I bought before this year, has gone from 23 to 20, so I have read 3 of those books. In terms of how well I did with my TBR, I didn't do great. This is the first month that I have been struggling with Italy. Basically, every month in my TBR I have some books that I have to read, and then I have some that are like options for me to read. And from the books that I had as must reads, I have read 4 of them. And one of them I have not finished, but I have started. I'm about 100 pages in, so at least I started it, but I didn't finish it. But then from the other options of things that I would have liked to read, I haven't actually read any of them. So a lot of them are moving to my next TBR. So with that said, let's get into the book. The first book that I finished this month is Abigail by Szabó, and this is about a girl, teenage girl, and when we met her, she lives with her dad and her sort of nanny, and she's around, I think, 15 or 16, at in the 40s in Hungary, and it has been decided for her that she's going to go to a boarding school instead of staying where she was, because her nanny is French and she has to go back to France because of the war, and so she goes to this boarding school and she's very unhappy. She really doesn't want to be there. And we follow her kind of meeting the other girls and judging them, even though it's really not that bad. And then at some point she starts making friends. But then all of the war issues come into the forefront a little bit more. And Szabó is very good at talking about the war without talking about the war. So, for example, there is this statue in the school that it's called Abigail, and all the girls go to her when they have a problem, and they expect sort of Abigail to fix it, even though they know it's a statue. But there is this kind of legend about it, and indeed that does happen. There are a couple of girls here that do get bad news about their families, and we are never told they're Jews, but it's kind of clear by the context that they're Jews, and that's why the issues are there. And so our main character does ask Abigail for help, and actually the records that say that these girls are Jews are lost somehow. So officially they are not in trouble anymore. And so there is the whole mystery as well of who is behind this Abigail statue. I feel like I'm not doing a very good summary of this, but basically it's a typical Szabó, building tension and having mysteries without really having that like formulaic plot of murder mysteries and stuff. Really enjoyed it. I think this one is my favorite after The Door. I think all of the characters were very fleshed out. Maybe there were a little bit too many of them, but I think this was one of those books that will benefit from a reread, so I might reread it, and then knowing a little bit more the context, I can follow the different characters better and notice more of the things that are told about them. The next book that I finished this month is The Everything War by Mattioli, and this was for my Buzzwordathon challenge. It was a book with thing in the title, so everything has thing in the title, and this is basically a non-fiction about Amazon. However, it is mostly about the very predatory tactics that Amazon employs to gain market and to take over small businesses, and how they sort of plagiarize many startups instead of giving them a fair compensation, stuff like that. And it's horrible. It's very, very horrible. I mean, Amazon Yeah, it's so much worse than you think it is. But I was also missing, there is some mentions of the workers' rights here and how bad the image of Amazon is in regards to how they treat their workers, but she never goes in depth into that. It's more of a passing mention. It also talks a lot about Jeff Bezos, which makes sense, but it's also a lot about his personality, and I was missing a little bit more of the context, because I have the feeling that this book was written not against the whole capitalist idea that Amazon takes advantage of, but just about the fact that Amazon takes advantage of it, if that makes sense. So, for example, there are some examples of things that Amazon did to some startups, and how Walmart, for example, did things in a much fairer way to compensate those startups and things like that. So you might end up reading this book and thinking that Walmart is amazing, which is like, well, they're better than Amazon. That's not a very high bar. But they have a whole lot of other issues. So I don't think that this book reflected that well enough. There is also a lot of talk about the privacy issues, and they do mention how that also involves other companies such as Google and Apple and Facebook, but we also don't go in depth into those other companies. It's mostly just about Amazon. So yeah, I'm glad I read it, and I think I got a lot from it, and I don't want to buy anything in Amazon anymore, ever. Not that I was buying a lot, but there are a couple of things every year that I find really difficult to find everywhere else. So I eventually occasionally buy in Amazon, and this makes me not want to do even that. But at the same time, I was hoping for more. I think there is a lot more discussion to be had, not only about Amazon, but about the bigger capitalistic world that allows Amazon to exist the way it exists. And that was not in here, so that disappointed me a little bit. The next book I read was Reading Lolita in Tehran by Azar and Nafisi, and this was again for the Buzz Wordathon cover challenge, which was to read a book with books in the cover, and you can see maybe there is a tiny book there, but if that is not good enough for you, there is another version of this book with lots of books in the cover, so I'm counting that. Anyway, this book is also a non-fiction. It's a memoir of the author, who was a literature professor in Tehran, especially following the revolution and how they oppressed women. So at the beginning of the book, she started sort of a literature class, reading club situation with some of her students from the university, because she didn't want to be part of the university structure anymore, because she was forced to wear a veil and comply to certain things from management, and she didn't want to do that. So instead she invited some of her best students to her house to discuss literature in a much more open, uncensored way, and one of the books that they read is Lolita, but they also the chapters are divided based on the things that they study. So there is Lolita, there is Gatsby, there is James, which is Henry James, and there is Austen. That doesn't mean that they only cover that. We also see other books from these and other authors that are discussed. And I think it was a very interesting way to go through the history of Iran and Tehran and the repressive regime that was there. I understand that this also is from a professor of English literature in Tehran, but I was hoping, there is some mentions of Iranian authors, but I was hoping for a little bit more of that and more of the local culture in a way. Although rightfully so, the author also mentions that people want this like exotic thing, but actually most teenagers in most countries listen and watch things from the US and maybe Japan, and Iran was no different. So that's what they also do, that's what they also study. But yeah, overall it's quite tender and I enjoyed it. Then we get into some prize reading, which is the main reason why I did so poorly with my TBR this month, and I knew that was gonna happen, but still. Yeah, the next one is The Story of a Heart by Rachel Clarke, and this is about two children that are sick. One of them is sick, like he has a heart condition. His heart is not strong enough to pump blood anymore, so he's in the hospital. They tried some treatments, they don't work, so the last resort is to get a heart transplant. And then we also follow this girl who was in a car accident, and basically she doesn't make it, and so her heart goes to this boy, and so it follows kind of the parallel story of the two people, but in between those it also has a lot of history of medicine and history of the different developments that allow for such a thing as a heart transplant, and so there is a lot of science in it as well. And this was very, very emotional. I was sobbing the whole way through. Every time any of these children was mentioned, I was crying. It's really well written in that sense, like it really gets the message across. And I also found the parts of the history interesting. I do find that when she switched, it was a little bit jarring, because you are in such an emotional state talking about the kids, and then she's like, now let's pause for a second and let's talk about this lung machine that allows the lungs to survive while you are transplanting the heart. And she tells you about the whole history of how this machine came to be. And you're like, I just want to read about the kids right now. And then of course you read that and it's interesting, but I found that a little bit jarring. But other than that, I think it was an excellent book. I'm very, very happy that it's in the shortlist. I would not be surprised if it wins, and I'm very glad I read it. The next book I read is Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov, and I read this for my book club, my in real life book club. And this was interesting. So this is basically playing with form more than anything else. There is a prologue, and then there is a poem, and then there is the commentary, which is the majority of the book, and then at the very end there is also an index, and all of it is part of the story and part of the book. So it's not an actual foreword or an actual commentary or anything. The author of the poem is supposed to be John Shade, who was murdered, and this is a fictional character, and then kind of the commentary goes through like the events, and I get that this was a commentary on literary criticism and kind of just being playful and funny with it, and one of the people in my book club loved it, and I understand why he loved it. I felt like this just went over my head. Like I kind of got the general point and I just didn't care about it anymore. There is no real like bigger message about it. It's just playful, and it's just not my thing. It's not funny. It's funny, but it's not only funny, it's also very playful with form. But yeah, it's not for me. The next book I read is Amma by Saraid Silva, which is also part of the Women's Prize for Fiction longlist. it's not announced yet what the shortlist is at the moment of recording, so I don't know if it made it or not. But it follows a generation of 3 women. So it's the grandma, the mom, and the daughter. And the grandmother is from Sri Lanka, and she was married when she was a child, and then she escaped and got an actual husband that she wanted, and they moved to New Zealand, and then the grandchild moves to London, and there is a little bit of it that happens in Singapore as well. And we follow like the different timelines. Roughly follow the timeline of when Josephine, the grandmother, was in Sri Lanka, and they moved, so around when she was like 10 until she was like 30 or something. And then the same for the mom, and then when we meet the daughter, she's around 20 something. And there is a little bit of a muddy history with them, with the family themselves, about what they went through, each of them. The children are not always welcomed into very functional families, and so that's an aspect of it. There is the aspect that at the beginning of this book we meet Annie, who is the granddaughter, in London, and she's about to meet this man that she knows of, but she doesn't know personally, and she really wants to get to know better, and she was stopped by her family from meeting him, but we don't know why at the beginning, and so that develops as well. And Annie is lesbian, bipolar, queer, and there is a big aspect of that queerness into this book as well, but it's not the main thing until the end, let's say. There is a big portion of the book where I forgot that was a thing, and then it came up and I was like, oh yeah, and then the end, it really develops around queerness. But there was a point in which Annie said something on the lines of, I sometimes think I could like men, but then they start speaking, and I remember that I won't never like men, something like that. That was funny. But yeah, overall, I enjoyed the story. I found the writing a little bit too elaborate and too meandering for my liking. It's that point in which it takes away from the story rather than immerse you in the story. So that I found a little bit challenging, but the story was good. Nothing amazing, but I liked it, and I would not be mad if it was in the shortlist. I also would be mad if it's not. Next book I read is Nesting by Roisín O'Donnell, which is also part of the long list for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and this is about a woman that is being emotionally abused and sexually abused, and so at the beginning of the book we see her trying to flee her husband with her 2 daughters, and kind of follow her not so much through the living of him, but of the staying away from him, and it's very frustrating in the best of ways. So when she leaves, he tries to emotionally manipulate her to come back, and you see her how this man affects her, basically. Like, he tells her, you're being crazy, I love you, why are you doing this, what are you doing to our daughters? And in her mind she's like, yeah, what am I doing? He's not that bad, he's just a little bit tired today, let's go back home and just sort things out. But at the same time you see how scared she is of him throughout the whole book, and it's so frustrating to see her doubting herself so much and not seeing how clearly manipulative he is being. It was, yeah, I told a friend, like, it's one book that you're reading and you want to throw out the window and then immediately go down and pick up the book and continue reading. because it's frustrating, but it's supposed to be frustrating. That's how it feels when you are seeing a woman that is being so manipulated for so long that she doesn't recognize what manipulation is anymore, and that happens to a lot of people. And I think that was done brilliantly. It also made me cry. It was great. There is also a part about the housing system, because when she leaves, she doesn't have anything. She was a stay-at-home mom, so she doesn't have much money. She doesn't have a place to stay. And so she ends up going into social housing, which basically social emergency housing, which is a room in a hotel. And in principle, when I first read that, was like, well, that doesn't sound too bad. Like, emergency housing in a hotel makes sense. But then you realize that when I think emergency housing, I think they're gonna stay there for 1 or 2 weeks, and it's not like that. They stay there for almost a year, and other people around her in other rooms in the hotel that are also there because of social issues, they're there for years. And living in a hotel for a year, it's a lot. Like, you cannot cook. Sometimes, like, whole families are in one room, and you are not allowed to use the facilities of the hotel. So basically, you're just like cooked into this place. There are babies that cannot learn to walk because they don't have enough space to learn how to walk. It's really not okay. And there is another layer of frustration with that, right? Because that shouldn't be the case. Like, sure, emergency housing in a hotel makes sense if it's for a week or two before you can find something a little bit more permanent. But it's not a solution for a year, for months. It doesn't work that way. So yeah, there is also that social aspect of this, which I also really enjoy. And also there is a lot of talk about the custody battles and how custody would work and things like that, which I also found very interesting. And yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I think it was very powerfully done, and I do hope it makes it to the shortlist. The next book I finished was Under the Eye of the Big Bird by Hiromi Kawakami, which is again a prize book, but this one was part of the International Booker. And this is sci-fi, I would say. It's about this world in which humans are starting to get extinct, and there doesn't seem to have been any big event that led to this occurring. It is more a question of humans just don't find reproducing so interesting anymore, which seems realistic. Like, some countries have less than, the mortality rate is higher than the birth rate, right? So that's how this book tells the story of we are going extinct because this is happening. And so at that point, they are so little humans that one of the main points of humans is to reproduce. And there are different ways that have been developed to reproduce. One of them is naturally creating children, but there's also clones that are being made, and there are different kind of types of clones. Some of them have like the memories of the first genes. So they take the genes, they create someone, and then when that person is about to die, they take the genes and then create a new person that has all of the memories of the previous person, if that makes sense. That's another way that they can do it. Then there is this group of people that are created with animal genomes, but they create people that can talk and think and all of that. And then there are the mothers who take care that sort of like everything is going to plan so that people are reproducing and they love the people. It's not like a repressive regime that is having a bigger goal or anything. It's just the mothers are there to really make sure that people grow up to be good humans. But they are also like we are not sure of their origin until the end. And so, yeah, it's a kind of a complicated book, and it's told in little vignettes. So at the beginning, we follow, for example, one of the groups of people that are created from animal genomes, and then we follow this other group of people in which they are reproducing naturally, but they have so many children, like 20, 30 children per family, and then we kind of are trying to paste all of those pieces together and try to understand how they fit. And then in the last chapters we get like a bit of a bigger picture of how these things came to be and how these things started working out, because we are also not super sure of the timeline. We don't know if these things happen at the same time, where some of them happen before and some of them happen after. It is a little bit of a mystery to piece out how the world works, and then at the end you kind of get an explanation, which I appreciated. I'm not sure everyone will, but I appreciated that we did get some kind of bigger picture of what was happening with these little pieces. Yeah, it was a very interesting read. I think I don't think I have read anything similar. It was very interesting to see this sci-fi world that seems that could happen to some extent, and it's so disjointed as well. The writing was very sparse, which I also appreciate. I think it made things feel crisp and clear, even though it was kind of not messy how it was presented, but it was not clear either, if that makes sense. So it made sense to at least make the writing crisp and clear, so that the complexity was within the story and within these different pieces of the puzzle. So yeah, I enjoyed it. I think it was very interesting, and I'm also kind of thinking that a reread will do this book good, because now that I know what I know, I can put the pieces where they belong a lot easier, of course. Then the last book that I finished this month was An African History of Africa by Zeinab Badawi, which was my longest book of my ancient TBR. This was, I think technically it's like 530 pages, but without the references it's like 450, so it's actually not that, I mean it is big, but it's not like massive big. And this goes to the history, mostly pre-colonial history of Africa, and the different kingdoms that there were. So it starts with the Egyptians, and then it goes through like things like I think in Sudan there was one. There's also in Ethiopia, the Great Zimbabwe, which were some ruins that were found. And it follows not only the fact that this kingdom has existed, which is already, I think, quite interesting to read about, because that's not something that we normally see in history lessons or anything like that. But there were some also very interesting discussions. There was, for example, a discussion about why North Africans often identify as Arabs rather than North Africans, and they want to separate themselves from the rest of Africa because of the image of Africa that most people have. Most people, when you say Africa, they think about black sub-Saharan Africa with a lot of corruption and a lot of poor people. And actually, Africa is one of the most culturally diverse, racially diverse places in Earth. And so we just should maybe embrace that diversity more and project that diversity more, rather than try to reject the idea of being African just because we don't identify with the idea that most people have in Africa. And I say we, I mean African people. But yeah, that is kind of the idea. There is also a lot of talk about how colonialism underestimated Africans, and how, for example, as I said, when the Great Zimbabwean ruins were found, the explorers thought and made these stories up that this could not have been made by Africans. There must have been made that by the Arabs or the Turks that came down all the way there, and they, in history books, it was often brought up, these ruins were brought up as a proof as how far down the Arabs came rather than what the Africans themselves built. Stuff like that comes up a lot as well. How the colonialists undermined everything that the Africans built and the Africans were, and how it does affect them still today. So I did really enjoy those parts, and I think this is a very important book. In terms of enjoyment, I don't think this is a book I overly enjoyed, but I don't think that's the fault of the book. I think I'm not the biggest history lesson fan, and this is ultimately a history book, so there is a lot of names and there is a lot of dates, and I'm normally not one that remembers any of this or retains any of these kind of things. So it's not because the book was bad, it's just that's what the book was, and that's not my preferred way of learning things. That's not the interesting parts for me, basically. But the discussions were very good, so I got that from it. And I think overall it's a very good book. And if you are into history, I think this is a must read for sure. Those are all the books that I read for my March. And as I said, I am now about 100 pages into NW by Zadie Smith, which was the oldest book in my TBR. So I should really have finished this, but I just didn't have time. Prices happen, that's what happens. But now, if we go into my April TBR, there are a few books that are kind of a must as well. So the first book that I'm hoping to read is Rebirding by Benedict Macdonald, which covers both the Buzzwordathon TBR, Buzzwordathon challenge and Buzzwordathon cover challenge, because it's like an animal in the title and an animal in the cover, which birding, and there are birds in the cover. And it's also the last book I have to read for reading all the One Right prize winners. So I really want to read this. However, there is another book in my TBR that can also cover those two prompts, so that I might do that if I don't have time. Then for the other challenges that I normally have, the book that has been in my TBR for the longest is Las Viudas de los Jueves by Claudia Piñeiro, which means the widows of Thursdays. I think it's about a bunch of widows that meet every Thursday, and it's very like high class Argentinian society, and then something happens and their lives are kind of shaked. And then for the longest book on my TBR, technically that would be There Are No Rivers in the Sky by Elif Shafak, but I am planning to get that from the library, and my library has 4 copies, all of which are due back in the middle of the month, and there are 2 people ahead of me in the waiting list, and I'm going on holidays at the end of the month, so I don't know if that's going to work out or not. You will see it in my next wrap-up, but if that doesn't work out, the book that is next, as my longest book in my TBR, is Ednan by Linnea Axelsson, which I wouldn't mind to read now. Actually, it's over 400 pages, but there's not a lot of words, so I think this can read pretty fast, which will be good because I still have prize reading to do. And also it's a Swedish book. It's like an epic on Swedish North provinces, so I would like to read it before it's completely summer. So I would like to read that, even regardless of what happens with Elif Shafak. And then for my book club, the book we're reading this month is Disobedient Bodies by Emma Dabiri. I have read an Emma Dabiri before, Don't Touch My Hair, and I really like that one. So I'm quite excited about this one, and it's also super short, and it's like very small as well. This is a normal paperback, and this one is smaller. So those are kind of the must. The other sort of must is Vulture Capitalism by Grace Blakely. This was in my previous TBR, and this was a if I read it will be nice kind of thing, but now I have renewed it as much as I can from the library, and it's due at the beginning of May, so I need to read it in April. And then the other 3 books that I want to read quite strictly in this, not super strict, but kind of really want to read in this month are the 3 books that I haven't read from the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction shortlist. So the shortlist for the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction was announced last week, and there were What the Wild Sea Can Be, which I have read, Private Revolutions, which I have read, and The Story of a Heart, which I have read, but there's also A Thousand Threads, which I haven't read and I want to read this month, Agent Zo, and Raising Hair. And Raising Hair also has a rabbit in the cover, a hare, so that will also work for the Buzzwordathon prompts if I don't get to Rebirding, but I would prefer to get to Rebirding too. These are kind of the books that I kind of want to really read this month, like my set TBR. And then if I read all of that and I still have time, the book that there are some books that I want to read apart from that. Sister-in-Law I was supposed to read last month because it was part of the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction longlist. It didn't make it to the shortlist, but I'm still very excited about it. However, I have been waiting for my copy for a month and it's still not here. So if it makes it this month and I have time, I would like to read it. And the other one that I have also been waiting for a month for, and it's also part of the prize stuff, is the Book of Disappearance, which is part of the International Booker longlist, and I also really want to read it. It sounds amazing. I have heard great reviews about it. I ordered my copy also at the end of February, and they sent me an email that because it was nominated for the longlist of the International Booker, they were short of copies and they had to reprint it, and they were going to try to send it in March, but they haven't. So I've sent them an email and I hope that that comes in April. And then if I have time, I can read it in April. And then the rest of the books that I didn't get to from March that I would still like to read either this month or in May, and maybe you will see these books coming up over and over because I don't have time to read them. But those are Not a Novel by Jenny Erpenbeck, Slime by Susan Welditch, and Chinatown by Tuan. These are for my Warwick's Prize for Women in Translation project, and these are the 3 that I need to read to catch up until the prize in 2024, and they are not very big, so I should really get to them, but I just didn't have time, and I probably will not have time in April, but if I have time, that will be great. So yeah, those are all the books that I'm hoping to get to in some form in the month of April. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have read any of the books I've mentioned, and until next video, bye!